The wind carved through the valley like a blade, kicking up dust that stung his eyes and coated his cracked lips. Elias Ward stood alone on the porch of his sagging ranch house, the horizon a bruise of purple and gold. His hands, knotted with years of rope burns and frostbite, gripped the railing as if it might keep him upright. The land stretched out before him, vast and merciless, its silence louder than any voice he'd ever known. His shadow stretched long across the dirt, thin and brittle as the man himself. Hunger gnawed at his gut, not just for food, though the pantry held only a tin of beans and a rind of stale bread, but for something he couldn't name. The kind of ache that settled in the bones after too many winters alone. The ranch was a ghost of what it had been. Fences leaned like drunks half buried in sand. The barn's roof gaped open, letting starlight spill onto rotted hay. Once there'd been cattle lowing, hands shouting, the clatter of life. Now, only the wind answered. Elias hadn't seen another soul in months, not since the last drifter passed through, begging for water and leaving with a stolen knife. He didn't chase the man. What was one more loss in a life carved from them? His boots creaked on the warped boards as he turned back inside. The house smelled of mildew and neglect, the air thick with the weight of years. A single lantern flickered on the table, casting shadows that danced like memories he couldn't shake. He sat heavily in the only chair, his knees protesting, and stared at the tin of beans. His hands shook as he reached for it, not from cold, but from the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't touch. The world outside didn't care if he lived or died. The stars kept their distance, indifferent to the man wasting away beneath them. He pried the tin open, the metal edge slicing his thumb. Blood welled, dark and slow, but he didn't flinch. Pain was an old friend. He ate mechanically, the beans, cold and tasteless, his eyes fixed on the far wall where a single photograph hung crooked. A woman's face, soft and young. Her smile a wound he couldn't stop picking at. Clara. The name burned in his throat, unspoken for years. She'd been the warmth of this place, the reason he'd fought the land's cruelty. But the fever took her, quickened and kind, leaving him with nothing but a grave out back and a silence that screamed louder every year. The wind rattled the shutters, and Elias's head jerked up. The sound cut through the night, not the usual coyote wail or creak of settling wood, but something sharper. A knock, faint, deliberate. It came again, like a stone dropped into still water. His heart kicked against his ribs, sudden and unfamiliar. No one came here, not anymore. His hand drifted to the rifle, leaning against the wall, its barrel cold as the fear curling in his chest. He stood, slow and stiff, and crossed to the door. The knock came a third time, softer now, almost pleading. Hesitated, fingers on the latch. The wind howled, urging him to ignore it, to crawl back to his chair and let the night swallow whatever stood outside. But something else stirred in him, curiosity, or maybe desperation. He cracked the door, the hinges groaning, and peered into the dark. A figure stood there, small and shrouded in a tattered coat, face hidden by a scarf. The lantern's light caught a pair of eyes, wide and haunted, staring up at him. A child, no more than 10, maybe 12, shivering in the cold. Elias's breath caught, his grip tightening on the rifle. "Who are you?" His voice was rough, unused, like gravel underfoot. The child didn't answer, only pointed to the horizon, where the last sliver of daylight bled out. Elias followed the gesture, squinting into the gloom. Nothing but dust and shadow. When he looked back, the child's eyes hadn't moved, locked on his with a weight he couldn't name. Something in that gaze cracked the ice around his heart. Just a hair, but enough to hurt. He stepped back, opening the door wider. "Get inside before you freeze." The child hesitated, then shuffled past him, bringing the smell of frost and fear. Elias closed the door. The wind's howl cut off, leaving only the sound of their breathing in the dim room. Asterisk, asterisk. The child stood just inside the door, a small, shivering shadow against the peeling walls. Elias watched as they unwound the scarf, revealing a face smudged with dirt and hollowed by hunger. A girl, he realized, her hair matted and dark, eyes too big for her thin frame. She didn't speak, only clutched her coat tighter, as if it could shield her from more than the cold. The lantern's glow flickered across her, catching the tremble in her hands. The way her gaze darted to the corners of the room like a trapped animal's, Elias felt the weight of her presence, an intrusion on the silence he'd built his life. Around, he set the rifle back against the wall, its clatter loud in the quiet. "Sit," he said, nodding to the chair. She didn't move at first, her eyes flicking to the tin of beans on the table, then back to him. He saw it then, the same gnawing ache he carried, mirrored in her. He pushed the tin toward her, the scrape of metal on wood sharp in the stillness. She hesitated, then slid into the chair, her movements careful, like she expected the floor to give way. She ate quickly, scooping beans with her fingers, her eyes never leaving him. Elias leaned against the wall, arms crossed, trying to ignore the way her presence stirred something in him, something he'd buried long ago. The house felt smaller with her in it, the air heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath outside. The wind moaned, rattling the windows like it wanted in. Elias's mind drifted, unbidden, to another night, years back. Clara's laughter filling this same room, her hands flour-dusted as she kneaded dough, her voice teasing. him about his crooked fence posts. He'd been a different man then, one who believed the land could be tamed, that love could outlast the seasons. But the fever came swift and cruel, and left him digging a grave under a sky as gray as her cooling skin. He'd stood thereafter, dirt under his nails. The shovel's weight heavier than the earth he'd moved. The memory clawed at him, sharp as the girl's gaze now. "Where'd you come from?" he asked, his voice low, not expecting an answer. She paused, a bean halfway to her mouth, and pointed again toward the horizon. Her silence was louder than words. Elias followed her gesture through the window, where the night swallowed the world. Beyond, nothing out there but scrub and stars, maybe a coyote or two. No town for miles, no wagon tracks, just the endless, unforgiving plain. He wondered what could drive a child out here alone, what kind of desperation could outrun fear. "Got a name?" He tried again. She looked down, her fingers tightening around the tin. "Leela," she whispered, so soft he barely caught it. The name hit him like a stone, stirring dust in his chest. Clara's sister had been a Leela, a girl long gone before. He'd met his wife. He shook his head, pushing the thought away. Just a coincidence. The world was full of names. He moved to the hearth, tossing a splintered log onto the dying fire. Sparks snapped, and the room warmed, though it did little for the chill in his bones. Lila watched him, her eyes tracking every movement, wary but curious. He wondered what she'd say, an old man, worn as the land, or something else. Something worth trusting. "Sleep here tonight," he said, jerking his chin toward the corner where a threadbare blanket lay. "Ain't much, but it's warm." Nodded, slow, and slid from the chair, curling up on the floor like a dog expecting a kick. Elias watched her for a moment, then turned away, his throat tight. He didn't know what to do with her, this ghost of a girl who'd wandered into his world. He didn't know how to be anything but alone. As he settled into his chair, the fire's glow cast long shadows, and he felt the weight of the past settle heavier. Clara's photograph stared at him from the wall, her smile a quiet accusation. He closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. The girl's breathing, soft and uneven, filled the room, a rhythm that both soothed and unsettled him. Outside, the wind kept its vigil, whispering secrets he wasn't ready to hear. The fire had dwindled to embers by dawn, its faint glow barely touching the frost that crept across the window panes. Elias woke stiff in his chair, his neck aching, his breath visible in the cold air. Lila still lay curled in the corner, the blanket pulled tight over her shoulders, her small form rising and falling with shallow breaths. He watched her for a moment, the sight foreign yet piercing, like a splinter lodged too deep to pull out. The house was silent, save for the faint creak of settling wood. But it felt different now, less empty, though he couldn't say why. He rose, joints protesting, and stepped outside to the porch. The morning was raw, the sky a pale gray that promised snow. The land stretched out unyielding, its cracked earth and brittle grass indifferent to the new weight in his home. He rubbed his hands together, the calluses scraping like sandpaper, and thought of the day ahead. There was wood to chop, a fence to mend, the endless fight to keep this place from crumbling entirely. But now there was her, this girl who stumbled into his life like a stray, and he didn't know what to do with her. Back inside, Leela was awake, sitting up with a blanket pulled around her. Her eyes followed him as he crossed to the hearth, stoking the fire back to life. The tin of beans was empty, and he cursed himself for not having more to offer. He rummaged through the pantry, finding only a half-rotted onion and a handful of dried corn. It'd have to do. He set a pot over the fire, the clank of metal loud in the quiet, and tossed in the scraps with a splash of water from his canteen. Lila watched, silent, her hands folded in her lap like she was afraid to take up space. "You run off from somewhere?" he asked, stirring the pot. The question hung heavy, but he kept his eyes on the fire, giving her room to answer or not. She shifted, the blanket rustling. "They're gone," she said, her voice small but steady. "Ma and Pa fever took 'em. I walked." Don't know how long. Elias's hand stilled on the spoon. The word fever hit like a blow, dragging up Clara's face, her shallow breaths, the way her hand had gone limp in his. He swallowed, the memory bitter as bile, and forced himself to keep stirring. "Where was this?" "East," she said. "Near the river bend. Wagon broke, and they—" Her voice cracked, and she stopped, her fingers twisting the blankets. "Edge." He nodded, not pressing. The river bend was days away, maybe weeks for a child on foot. He tried to picture her out there, alone in the vastness, with nothing but hunger and grief to keep her moving. The image tightened something in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. He ladled the thin broth into a chipped bowl and set it before her. "Eat slow," he said. "Ain't much, but it's warm." She took the bowl, her hands trembling, and sipped carefully. Elias sat across from her, his own hunger forgotten. He saw the way she held the bowl close, like it might vanish, and he thought of Clara. Again, how she'd feed strays, her soft voice coaxing them closer. He'd teased her for it once, called it a waste. Now, he wondered if she'd been trying to teach him something he was too stubborn to learn. The day passed in uneasy quiet. Lila stayed close to the fire, her eyes tracking him as he would, patching a leak in the roof, checking the traps for anything to eat. She didn't offer to help and he didn't ask, but her presence was a weight he couldn't ignore. By afternoon, clouds thickened overhead, and the air grew sharp with the promise of snow. He glanced at her, bundled in the blanket, and felt a tug of something dangerous, responsibility maybe, or worse. "Hope you can't stay out here forever," he said, breaking the silence as he sharpened his knife by the fire. "Ain't safe for a kid." She looked at him, her eyes older than her years. "Ain't safe nowhere," she said, and the truth of it cut deeper than the blade in his hand. He didn't answer, just kept working the whetstone, the rhythmic scrape filling the space between them. Outside, the first snowflakes fell, soft and relentless, burying the world in white. Snow fell steady now, blanketing the ranch in a hush that felt both sacred and suffocating. Elias stood by the window, his breath fogging the glass, watching the world blur into white. The fire crackled behind him, its warmth barely reaching the edges of the room where Leela sat, still wrapped in the blanket, her eyes fixed on the flames. The broth was gone, the bowl scraped clean, and the silence between them had thickened, heavy with unspoken questions. Elias felt it pressing against his ribs, the need to know more, to understand why this girl was here, and what he was supposed to do with her. He turned from the window, his boots scuffing the floor, and sat across from her. The lantern's light carved deep shadows into his face, making him look older, harder. "You said they're gone," he started, his voice low, careful. "Anyone else, kin? Someone looking for you?" Lila's fingers tightened on the blanket, her knuckles pale. "No one," she whispered, "just me." Her gaze stayed on the fire, but Elias saw the flicker of something in her eyes, grief, maybe, or fear. He recognized it. The same shadow that stared back at him from Clara's photograph every night. He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight, and let the silence settle again. His mind drifted, unmoored, to a memory he rarely touched. A summer day, years before Clara's fever, when they'd ridden out to the creek, her laughter bright as the sun on the water. She'd talked about children then, her voice soft with longing, her hand resting on his arm. He'd brushed it off, said the land was too hard for dreams like that. Now, the memory stung, sharp as the snow driving against the windows. He wondered if Clara would have known what to do with this girl, if her heart would have opened where his stayed locked. The fire popped, sending a spark onto the hearth. Lila flinched, her eyes darting to him, and he saw it again, that wariness, like she expected him to turn her out into the storm. He wanted to say something, to ease the fear, but words felt clumsy, rusted from disuse. Instead, he stood and grabbed his coat from the hook. "Stay put," he said, pulling it on. "Need to check the barn. Snow's piling up." She nodded, small and quick, and he stepped into the cold. The wind bit at his face, snow swirling around him as he trudged to the barn. The door groaned as he shoved it open, the smell of damp wood and old hay hitting him like a memory. He checked the beams, the roof's weak spots, his hands moving by rote, but his mind was back in the house, with the girl who'd appended his solitude. He didn't know how to care for her, didn't know if he could. The thought scared him more than the storm. When he returned, cheeks raw from the cold, Lila was still by the fire, but she'd pulled the blanket tighter, her knees drawn up. He hung his coat, snow dripping onto the floor, and noticed something. Newer, small, worn book on the table, its cover frayed. He hadn't seen it before. "That yours?" he asked, nodding toward it. She hesitated, then nodded. "Pose, only thing I kept." Her voice was barely audible, but it carried a weight that made Elias's chest ache. He picked it up, careful, like it might break. A Bible, the pages thin and yellowed, names scrawled inside the cover in faded ink. He set it back down, his fingers lingering. "You read it?" "Some," she said. "Pa used to, said it helped." Elias didn't reply. He'd stopped praying years ago, after Clara's grave was dug. But the sight of the book, the way Leela's voice softened when she spoke of it, stirred something in him. Not faith, exactly, but a memory of it, like the scent of rain on dry earth. He sat again, the fire's warmth finally reaching him. "Storm will pass by morning," he said. "We'll figure things out then." It wasn't much, but it was all he had to offer. Leela looked at him, her eyes searching, and for the first time, she didn't look away. The firelight danced between them, and Elias felt the walls of his heart shift, just enough to let a sliver of light in. The storm raged through the night, a howl that shook the walls and buried the ranch deeper in snow. Elias barely slept, his chair by the fire creaking each time he shifted, his eyes drifting to Leela's small form in the corner. She stirred once, murmuring something he couldn't catch, her face tight with dreams. The sound of her voice, even in sleep, tugged at him, a reminder of how fragile this moment was, how easily it could break. By morning, the wind had quieted, leaving a heavy silence and a world transformed in white. Elias rose before dawn, his breath clouding in the cold room. He stoked the fire, the scrape of the poker loud against the stillness, and glanced at Leela. She was awake, sitting up with the blanket around her shoulders, her eyes following him like they had the day before. But there was something different now, a flicker of trust, or maybe just exhaustion. He didn't know which scared him more. He boiled the last of the corn into a thin gruel, the pot hissing over the flames. They ate in silence, the spoon scraping against chipped bowls. Outside, the snow gleamed under a weak sun, the horizon sharp and endless. Elias felt the weight of the day pressing in. What to do with her, where she could go. The nearest town was a hard day's ride, and he had no horse, only his own worn boots. The thought of sending her out alone twisted his gut, but keeping her here, in this decaying place, felt just as wrong. "You ever been to Colton?" he asked, breaking the quiet. The town's name felt strange on his tongue, a place he hadn't seen in years. Lila shook her head, her spoon pausing. "Heard of it. Pa said it was rough." "It is," Elias said, his voice flat. He remembered the saloon's clamor, the hard stares of men who'd lost more than they'd won. But there were families there, too, and a preacher who might know what to do with a girl like her. Might be someone there who can help. Her eyes flicked to his, sharp and sudden. "You sending me away?" The question hung there, raw and unguarded. Elias set his bowl down, his hands clenching under the table. He wanted to say no, to tell her she could stay, but the word stuck. This wasn't a place for a child. Not with winter closing in and his own heart so brittle it might shatter under the weight of caring. "Ain't decided," he said finally, hating how cold it sounded. "Just thinking." Lila looked down, her fingers twisting the blanket's edge. The fire popped, and Elias felt the silence stretch, heavy as the snow outside. He stood, needing to move, and grabbed his coat. "Gonna clear the path to the barn. Stay here." He stepped into the cold, the snow crunching under his boots, and set to work with a shovel, his breath puffing in the air. Each scoop was a distraction, a way to push back the decision looming over him. But as he worked, his mind wandered to Clara again, not her death this time, but her life. The way she'd hum while mending his shirts, the way she'd leave wildflowers on the table after a storm. She'd have taken Lila in without a second thought, would have seen the girl as a gift, not a burden. The thought stung, a quiet rebuke. By midday, the path was clear, and Elias's hands were numb. He returned to find Lila by the window, her breath fogging the glass as she stared out. The Bible lay open on the table, a page marked with a scrap of cloth. He didn't ask about it, just hung his coat and sat by the fire, the warmth doing little for the chill inside him. "You don't have to decide today," Lila said suddenly, her voice soft but steady. She didn't turn from the window. "I can work. I'm strong." Elias looked at her, the smallness of her frame belying the steel in her words. He saw Clara in her, then not in her face, but in the quiet defiance, the refusal to be broken. His throat tightened, and he nodded, though she couldn't see it. "We'll see," he said, and for the first time he meant it. The sun climbed higher, its light spilling through the window, and the room felt a little less like a tomb. Asterisk, asterisk, the days blurred into a rhythm of survival, each one carved from the cold and the quiet. Snow piled high around the ranch, sealing them in, and Elias found himself measuring time by the fire's hunger for wood and the slow thinning of their provisions. Lila settled into the edges of his world, a shadow that moved with purpose. She swept the floors without being asked, her small hands gripping the broom like it was a lifeline. She hauled water from the well, her breath puffing in the frigid air, and once, she patched a hole in the wall with mud and straw, her fingers red and raw. Elias watched her work, saying little, but the sight stirred something in him, admiration maybe, or guilt for how easily he'd thought to send her away. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It held a kind of understanding, built from shared glances and the clink of spoons and bowls. Lila spoke sparingly, but when she did, her words carried weight. One night, as the fire cast long shadows, she sat with her father's Bible open, tracing the words with a finger. "Pa said this was about hope," she said, not looking up. "Even when everything's gone." Elias glanced at the page, the words unfamiliar but heavy with her faith in them. "Your PA sounds like he was a good man," he said, his voice. "Rough he was," she replied, and the simplicity of it cut him. He thought of Clara again, her voice reading aloud by lamplight, her fingers soft on his arm. He'd forgotten how it felt to share a room with someone who believed in something bigger than the dirt under their feet. The memory came unbidden, a winter like this one, Clara wrapped in a shawl, her laughter warming the room as she told him stories of her childhood, tales of a sister lost young, a mother who sang hymns, a father who carved wooden birds. Elias had listened, half lost in her voice, not knowing those moments would be what he'd cling to after she was gone. Now, with Lila across from him, he felt that old ache stir, not just for Clara but for the man he'd been before the land and loss hardened him outside. The snow kept falling, soft and relentless, burying the past a little deeper. Elias began, teaching Lila small things: how to check the traps, how to mend a fence post, how to listen for the wind shift before a storm. She learned fast, her eyes sharp with focus, and he found himself talking more, his voice less rusty with each day. He told her about the ranch in its better years, about the cattle drives, the men who'd laughed and fought under this roof. He didn't mention Clara, not yet, but her shadow hung over every story. One morning, as they cleared snow from the porch, Lila stopped, her shovel still. "You ever think of leaving?" she asked, her breath clouding in the air. Elias paused. his hands tight on the shovel's handle. The question hit like a stone, stirring up dust he'd let settle. Thought about it, he admitted after. Things changed. But this is home, all I got left. She nodded, her eyes on the horizon where the snow met the sky in a seamless white. I don't know where mine is anymore, she said. So quiet he almost missed it. He wanted to say something, to offer her more than this broken-down ranch, but the words wouldn't come. Instead he handed her his scarf, the wool rough but warm. Put this on, wind's picking up. She took it, wrapping it around her neck, and they worked on in silence. But the moment lingered, a crack in the wall he'd built around himself. He saw it now, the choice looming, not just for her but for him. To keep her here, to let her in, meant risking the pain of loss again. To send her away meant staying safe, but alone, in a house that echoed with ghosts. The weight of it pressed against his chest, heavier than the snow. That night, as the fire burned low, Leela fell asleep with the Bible open in her lap, her face soft in the glow. Elias watched her, the ache in his heart both sharp and warm, like the first thaw after a long winter. The snow slowed, leaving the ranch cocooned in a stillness that felt like the world holding its breath. Elias woke to a faint light seeping through the frost-etched windows, the kind of dawn that promised nothing but cold. Lila was already up, kneeling by the hearth, coaxing the fire back to life with a handful of kindling. Her movements were careful, practiced now, and Elias felt a pang at how quickly she'd adapted to this place, with its leaks and creaks and ghosts. He wondered if she saw it as a refuge or a cage. He rose, his bones protesting, and set about the morning tasks. The air outside was sharp, the snow crunching underfoot as he checked the traps. One held a rabbit, its body stiff with cold, and he carried it back, his hands numb but steady. Lila watched as he skinned it, her face unreadable, and when he handed her the knife to try, she took it without flinching. Her cuts were clumsy but sure, and Elias nodded, a silent approval. They cooked the meat over the fire, the smell filling the room with a rare warmth. As they ate, the silence between them felt different, less like a wall, more like a bridge. Elias caught himself watching her, the way her eyes softened when she chewed, the way her fingers brushed the Bible's cover like it was a talisman. He thought of asking her to read from it, to hear what words she clung to, but the thought felt too raw, too close to something he wasn't ready to face. Instead, he cleared his throat. We'll need more wood soon. Storm's gone, but winter's not. Lila nodded, wiping her hands on her coat. I can help. Show me how to split it. He studied her, the smallness of her frame against the stubborn set of her jaw. All right, he said, and they bundled up, stepping into the cold. The axe was heavy in her hands, but she swung it with a fierceness that surprised him, the wood splitting unevenly but true. Her breath puffed in the air, her cheeks red, and for a moment, Elias saw Clara in her, not in her face, but in the way she refused to let the land break her. The work carried them through the day, and as the sun sank, painting the snow gold, Elias felt the weight of the choice he'd been avoiding. Lila wasn't just a stray anymore. She was a presence, a spark in the dark of his life. But the ranch was no place for her, not long-term, not with spring so far off and his own strength waning. He thought of Colton again, the preacher, the families. Someone there could take or give her a bed that wasn't a floor, a life that wasn't this endless fight against the cold. The thought twisted his gut, but so did the idea of keeping her here, tethered to his ghosts. That night, as the fire burned low, Leela spoke first. You don't talk about her, she said, her eyes on the photograph on the wall, the woman in the picture. Elias's heart stuttered. He hadn't expected the words, hadn't braced for them. Clara, he said, the name rough in his throat. My wife, she's gone. Leela nodded, her gaze steady. You miss her. He looked away, the fire's glow blurring in his vision. Every day. She didn't push, just sat there, the Bible in her lap, her fingers tracing its edges. The silence that followed was soft, like the snow outside, and Elias felt something shift inside him, a crack widening, letting in light he'd thought long extinguished. He could send her to Colton, let her go, and keep his heart locked, or he could let her stay, risk the pain of caring, and maybe find something worth living for. He stood, his chair scraping, and stepped to the window. The snow stretched endless under the stars, but it didn't feel so heavy now. Get some sleep, he said, his voice softer than he meant. We'll talk tomorrow. Leela nodded, curling up with the blanket, and Elias watched the fire die, its embers glowing like the first stirrings of hope. Outside, the night was still, the wind quiet, and the ranch felt less like a grave, more like a place where something new might grow. She didn't push, just sat there, the Bible in her lap, her fingers tracing its edges. The silence that followed was soft, like the snow outside, and Elias felt something shift inside him, a crack widening, letting in light he'd thought long extinguished. He could send her to Colton, let her go, and keep his heart locked, or he could let her stay, risk the pain of caring, and maybe find something worth living for. He stood, his chair scraping, and stepped to the window. The snow stretched endless, under the stars, but it didn't feel so heavy now. Get some sleep, he said, his voice softer than he meant. We'll talk tomorrow. Lila nodded, curling up with a blanket, and Elias watched the fire die, its embers glowing like the first stirrings of hope. Outside the night was still, the wind quiet, and the ranch felt less like a grave, more like a place where something new might grow.